Hi all, today we have once again a chess game from the Wizard of Riga. Mikhail Tal, the former world champion, plays as black versus Aevski, which I do not know. I'm not even sure if I pronounced his name correctly, and I could not even find one more game from him, so if anyone could tell me something about this player, it would be much appreciated. Let's start with the game. e4, Tal likes to play the Sicilian, c5, knight f3. Well, this is all pretty known basic opening stuff. And even though that this move, e5, also is pretty known, I'm going to spend a little bit of time on it. Of course, e5 gains center control. It hits the knight standing on d4, and it gives e7 to the f8 bishop. However, there also is a downside of this move. That is, it weakens the square e5, and it creates a backward pawn on d6. And you have to be aware of this. Well, let's have a look at it. Let's say white would play knight to b3. Of course, knight takes c6 is playable, but it gives black a pretty strong center. After knight b3, we will waste a move for black and play, well, what's useless? Let's say h6, I think. Now let's see how white can play. White plays bishop to c4 and adds more control over the square in front of the pawn. If your opponent has a backwards pawn, you will try to keep it in its tracks on its current position, so you have to control the square in front of it. Right now you can see the bishop on c4, the knight on c3, the pawn on e4 and the queen on d1 have influence on that square. Of course, black can try to challenge this by a move like bishop to e6. It also adds more control to d5 for black, and it hits the bishop on c4. But in this current position, I really like a move like queen d3. It defends the bishop, and also it clears d1 for the h1 rook or the a1 rook. If white is allowed, he might castle to the king side, then the rook standing on h1 goes to d1, also adding pressure on the d5 square and also hitting the pawn one more time. Now if black trades the bishops, then of course the white queen will come to c4. The rooks will double on the d file, and I would also like the idea of placing a knight on d5 in the future. Black has to watch it that he does not lose a knight for the bishop standing on c1, because then you never can kick the knight away from its tremendous home. Of course, after the move queen to d3 in this position, black still has play. Could play a move like, well, let's say knight to b4. It hits the queen on d3. It might deflect the bishop, because I think that bishop to b5 check now is a playable move. Another option for black is to play queen to b6, which prevents white from castling to the king side for the moment. But I like the idea that white has a very clear point to attack. In the actual game, after knight b3, Mikhail Tal played bishop e6 and prevents bishop c4 and all the lines we just looked at. After bishop e6, white plays bishop e3, now bishop e7, queen d2 and a5 with a threat of a4 tickling the b3 knight. So white prevents a4 by playing a4 himself. Now he gives b4 a fine home for the knight on c6 for a while. Black castles and white castles to the opposite side. When castling on the opposite side occurs, we usually have a very nice attacking game. Okay, if you have a look at the current position, then we can see that the white king standing on c1 is on a half open file. Black of course wants to place his rook on c8, exploiting that the king on c1. The a4 pawn also is a bit weakening the king side. It also gives, as mentioned earlier, b4 as a nice home for the knight. If ever white wanted to chase the knight with the pawn move, then he would weaken his king side even further. Aside from that, the bishop on e6 already has good influence attacking influence on that side. The black queen has two different diagonals to choose from to enter the position. Also, it can choose to add itself on the c-file, adding pressure to the black king in that way. If you look at black's king's position, then it's a bit more solid, especially because the pawns are all on its initial starting position. The white pieces will have more difficulty in reaching the black's king side, so an idea would be to start a pawn rush, but since the pawns are still, as mentioned, on the initial position, it will take longer to open a file. Black plays rook c8, and white responds with z4, trying to push its own agenda, which is very logical, because most often than not, the side who starts defending the threats is the more passive side, and therefore more often is the side that loses the game. Black plays knight b4, placing the steed on the tremendous home. White now plays c5, continuing with the pawn star. Knight to d7. On d7 it prepares to jump to c5 or b6 in the near future. And now white plays h4. Tal continues with knight b6. A common error in these kinds of positions is that black plays a move like g6. Now g6 might seem to stop the pawn on g5 in its tracks, but actually it's helping white a little bit, because it weakens the king's position. After g6, white can freely play h5, and now there's nothing that black can do to prevent that white will have an open h-file, and on that open or half open h-file, white can launch an attack against black's king. Therefore, it is much better to leave the pawn on g6, and if white pushes the h4 pawn to h5 or h6, then we still can choose to trade or move the pawn to g6, and also sometimes you might want to leave it on g7, because if white takes, then we can use the pawn on g7 as a kind of shield, but I don't think that in this position it would work, because there is a rook standing on h1. A move like g6 here would actually help white. Of course, Tal has no intention of helping white, and he plays a very good move, knight to b6. As you can see, the knight on b6 is hitting the pawn on a4, which is not accurately defended, because if we are allowed to take, then the knight on c3 cannot recapture, because the rook is controlling the c-file for the moment. If the knight leaves the c-file, then the bishop standing on e6 can capture the knight on b3, again hitting the knight on a, and also hitting the pawn on c2. After knight b6, white continues with h5, trying to push its own agenda, but in fact it's a mistake. h5 is in fact a mistake. But Art, you just told us that you should always try to put your own agenda. But this is something called realistic, and it's the exception to the rule. Let me explain. Much better would have been a move like bishop b5, that defends against the threat of black, who is trying to take on a4. Also, it adds control to c6, d7 and e8. After white's response, h5, continuing the pawn storm, black is in marvelous position. Knight takes a4. If white would try taking the knight, then we have bishop takes b3 as seen earlier. Knight to c3 does not help, because now we have both bishop takes c2 or knight takes c2. Well, now what to do? I think that the best try is something like king to b1. After king to b1, black would take the knight. Well, recapturing is pretty forced here. We have a4. Once again, taking is pretty forced. After c takes, we capture the knight and also hit the pawn on c2. So once again, let's capture. And now bishop takes b3, and this white is in a world of hurt here, You can see that white is threatening to win the rook at the very moment. It's a one move threat. Also, the rook on c is threatening to lift itself either to c6 or to c2. If white plays a rook to c1, then we trade the rooks, and we can continue with queen to a8. Once again, black is harassing the white's king position. The queen on a8 is threatening mate on a2 now. The rook on f8 might come into the position through c8, or if the queen is moved, then it can move to a8. Also, the black bishop on e7 can pretty soon, if wanted, join the party in harassing the king by simply moving the pawn d6 to d5. Queen b2 seems the most effective defense here. Well, and after queen to b2 we can move our queen to a4. I'm sure that most of you can see that white is in a world of hurt here. If nothing else, then black can add to its material advantage. Also, the white king will be open for the rest of the game, so leave it to Tal to handle such a position. A possible continuation here, if white would try to keep on to the material, would be bishop to d2, but it will be really awful. And then we have rook a8. Now we threaten to check with the bishop on a2. If the king moves, then he will lose the queen to rook to c8, and or will get checkmated. I'll quickly show you in the sideline. Bishop e2, now check. King to c1, king to a1, then of course we have a discover check. Now rook to c8 check, bishop to c3, bishop takes c5 check. Well, only sensible move here is queen d2, and that's not sensible at all. So bishop to h3 prevents rook to c8, rook to a6 renews the threat, b5. Well, from here there are many winning lines. I will just show you one. For example, queen takes b5. Now bishop to f1 does not work because you have bishop a2 check, king c1, rook c6 check. Only move which does not lose the queen is bishop to c3. We take on z5 check again, king to d1, queen b3 check, queen captures queen, we capture the queen, the bishop is in, the white king still is in check, and here you perfectly see the vulnerability of the white king. That was a rather lengthy variation, starting with king b1. We were here in the actual game, move 16, after the last move from white was g6. In the actual game, white tried g6, still pushing his own agenda, and now Tal played bishop takes b3, c takes b3, knight takes c3, b takes c3. You can see how much the white king side is weakened right now, because black plays rook takes c3. Of course the queen cannot recapture, as you can see. Then the black knight on b4 has a royal fork. So 2 odd moves are possible only. 3 odd moves, of course. He can intervene with his queen, but that's just silly. He can move his king to b2, but then we have rook to c2, which also wins the queen. So Aevski white played king to b1. That leaves rook takes b3 check. Once again, not giving much options to white. White chooses to play his king to a1, but now queen to d7, threatening mate. And well, white does not have a realistic way of coping with it. You could try something silly like rook to h2, but it only prolongs the checkmate, because now queen to a4 check. Well, queen to a2, and I'm sure I really don't have to continue this line. In this position, queen to d7, white resigned because of the pending checkmate. Something entirely unrelated. If you are ever hungry, you could try to make a sandwich out of fried eggs. Add some ham, add some cheese, add some pesto, and add some mayonnaise. And you can be pretty sure that you're not going to be hungry anymore. However, you are then trading hungry for being nauseous, so it's up to you. Thank you very much for joining me, and have a good day. Bye bye.